Hello and welcome to The Bard's Truth with your host, the Green Bard. This is the Direwolves of Winterfell, episode 6-4, covering how Jon and Ghost meet, bond with, and save Samwell Tarly on the wall in A Game of Thrones. A Game of Thrones, Jon IV. As Tyrion and Jon's stories part, Jon immediately finds a new friend in Samwell Tarly. First, though, Jon considers how much of his time on the wall is better spent when Ghost was able to be at his side. I do find it interesting how Ghost is able to help him hunt, and I wonder if it is indicative that their bond is getting closer. Perhaps there is some instinctual, subconscious mental communication between them. It isn't mentioned anywhere else in the saga that the other Starks hunt with their direwolves at their sides, though Dany does wistfully contemplate hunting with Drogon at one time. Either way, I suppose Ghost's muteness is an asset on a hunt, especially if there is mental communication going on. Later, Jon considers that Ghost only marginally makes the experience of spreading gravel more tolerable. But it gives him time to think. He thinks of Samwell Tarly. Preston Jacobs points out in his Night's Watch video series that Ghost seems to affect Jon's thoughts around Sam. I will say that the phrase found himself thinking of Samwell Tarly is in the passive voice, which definitely leaves open the possibility that Ghost drove his thoughts in that direction. As far as we know, Ghost hasn't even seen Sam yet, though, so it would have to be a third party, such as Bloodraven, who works to get Ghost to influence Jon's thoughts, in this instance, at least. Life at Castle Black followed certain patterns. The mornings were for swordplay, the afternoons for work. The Black brothers set new recruits to many different tasks to learn where their skills lay. Jon cherished the rare afternoons where he was sent out with Ghost ranging at his side to bring back game for the Lord Commander's table. But for every day spent hunting, he gave a dozen to Donal Noy in the armory, spinning the whetstone while the one-armed smith's sharpened axes grown dull from use, or pumping the bellows as Noy hammered out a new sword. Other times he ran messages, stood guard, mucked out stables, fletched arrows, assisted Maester Aemon with his birds, or Bowen Marsh with his counts and inventories. That afternoon, the watch commander sent him to the winch cage with 4 barrels of fresh crushed stone to scatter gravel over the icy footpaths atop the wall. It was lonely and boring work, even with Ghost along for company, but Jon found he did not mind. On a clear day, you could see half the world from atop the wall, and the air was always cold and bracing. He could think here, and he found himself thinking of Samwell Tarly. And oddly, of Tyrion Lannister. He wondered what Tyrion would have made of the fat boy. Most men would rather deny a hard truth than face it, the dwarf had told him, grinning. The world was full of cravens who pretended to be heroes. It took a queer sort of courage to admit to cowardice as Samwell Tarly had. Ghost is shadowing Jon the next time he sees Sam, who is sitting alone in the common hall. Jon joins him on the bench, even though he thinks he'd enjoy his friend's company more. Sam seems alarmed at Ghost's appearance, but you'd think a craven would act even more afraid of such a beast. I wonder if Ghost was telepathically soothing Sam's fear. Either way, the trio go for a walk after eating. Ghost, in his place, shadowing Jon, silently. The evening meal was almost done by the time he and Ghost reached the common hall. A group of the Black brothers were dicing over mulled wine near the fire. His friends were at the bench nearest the west wall, laughing. Pip was in the middle of a story. The mummer's boy with big ears was a born liar with 100 different voices, and he did not tell his tales so much as live them, playing all the parts as needed, a king one moment and a swineherd the next. When he turned into an alehouse girl or a virgin princess, he used a high falsetto voice that reduced them all to tears of helpless laughter, and the eunuchs were always eerily accurate caricatures of Sir Alistair. Jon took as much pleasure from Pip's antics as anyone, yet that night he turned away and went instead to the end of the bench, where Samwell Tarly sat alone, as far from the others as he could get. He was finishing the last of the pork pie the cooks had served up for supper when Jon sat down across from him. The fat boy's eyes widened at the sight of Ghost. "Is that a wolf?" "A direwolf," Jon said. "His name is Ghost. The direwolf is the sigil of my father's house." Later that chapter. "I'm fat. Not blind, Samwell Tarly said. Of course I saw it. It's 700 feet high. Yet he stood up all the same, wrapped a fur-lined cloak over his shoulders, and followed Jon from the common hall, still wary as if he suspected some cruel trick was waiting for him in the night. Ghost padded along beside them. I never thought it would be like this, Sam said as they walked. Eventually, Sam breaks down in tears after Jon asks why he's here if he's afraid of everything. Like with Jon earlier, Ghost takes the initiative to calm Sam. Sam's only startled for a moment, but then he starts laughing. Again, he should be deathly afraid of the beast, yet instead, Ghost seems to make him feel happy. I do believe that Ghost must be telepathically soothing the boy, with magic in this instance. We also must ask, is Ghost doing this because he instinctively likes Sam, because he sees that Jon likes the fat boy, or because of some other actor's influence? We can't answer now, but we should keep this question in mind as we go forward. After this, Jon lets his guard down and ends up telling a closely guarded secret about his dreams of the Winterfell crypts. I'm relatively certain that these dreams are telepathically given to Jon, but the reason for them is yet unclear. Either way, one thing that interests me about the dreams is how Jon recalls that Ghost would comfort him when he awoke. This implies that Ghost was beside him on the nights Jon dreamt these dreams, which leaves open the possibility that he may be part of how they were sent to Jon. Regardless, in a moment of affection, it's clear that the dire wolf does make Jon feel better. The same is true in this moment, in how scratching Ghost's ears seemingly makes Sam feel comfortable enough to tell his story about his banishment from Horn Hill. While it isn't apparent when we first read A Game of Thrones, we learn later in the books that physical contact heightens the mind meld of the bond, so Ghost's feelings could more easily be transferred to Sam when they touch. Samwell Tarly looked at himself for a long moment, and his round face seemed to cave in on itself. He sat down on the frost-covered ground and began to cry, huge choking sobs that made his whole body shake. Jon could only stand and watch. Like the snowfall on the Barrowlands, it seemed the tears would never end. It was Ghost who knew what to do. Silent as a shadow, the pale direwolf moved closer and began to lick the warm tears off Samwell Tarly's face. The fat boy cried out, startled, and somehow, in a heartbeat, his sobs turned to laughter. Jon Snow laughed with him. Afterward, they sat on the frozen ground, huddled in their cloaks, with Ghost between them. Jon told the story of how he and Robb had found the pups newborn in the late summer snows. It seemed 1,000 years ago now. Before long, he found himself talking of Winterfell. Sometimes I dream about it, he said. I'm walking down this long, empty hall. My voice echoes all around, but no one answers, so I walk faster, opening doors, shouting names. I don't even know who I'm looking for. Most nights it's my father, but sometimes it's Robb instead, or my little sister Arya, or my uncle. The thought of Benjen Stark saddened him. His uncle was still missing. Later. Do you ever find anyone in your dream? Sam asked. Jon shook his head. No one. The castle is always empty. He had never told anyone of the dream, and he did not understand why he was telling Sam now. Yet somehow it felt good to talk of it. Even the ravens are gone from the rookery, and the stables are full of bones. That always scares me. I start to run then, throwing open doors, climbing the tower 3 steps at a time, screaming for someone, for anyone. And then I find myself out in front of the door to the crypts. It's black inside, and I can see the steps spiraling down. Sometimes I know I have to go down there, but I don't want to. I'm afraid of what might be there waiting for me. The old kings of winter are down there. So is Lyanna. Sitting on their thrones with stone wolves at their feet and iron swords across their laps. But it's not them I'm afraid of. I scream that I'm not a Stark, that this isn't my place, but it's no good. I have to go anyway, so I start down, feeling the walls as I descend, with no torch to light the way. It gets darker and darker until I want to scream. He stopped, frowning, embarrassed. That's when I always wake. His skin cold and clammy, shivers in the darkness of his cell. Ghost would leap up beside him, his warmth as comforting as daybreak. He would go back to sleep with his face pressed into the direwolf's shaggy white fur. "Do you dream of Horn Hill?" Jon asked. "No." Sam's mouth grew tight and hard. "I hated it there." He scratched Ghost behind the ear, brooding, and Jon let the silence breathe. After a long while, Samwell Tarly began to talk, and Jon Snow listened quietly and learned how it was that a self-confessed coward found himself on the wall. When Jon decides to have the rest of the recruits protect Sam, he has to use Ghost to literally fill Rast with the fear of God, or in this case, the fear of the old gods, for which Ghost is an avatar. This scene appears to be a very strong indication of mind mingling in the bond of Jon and Ghost. Ghost, with his eyes that burned red as embers, mirrors Jon's anger at Rast's defiance. Their cooperation in this scene is quite close, reminiscent of the scene with Robb and Grey Wind when they first threatened Cleos Frey. The ploy worked in both cases, so we can chalk up another mark for the theme of the wolves instilling fear in adversaries. "You girls do as you please," Rast said, "but if Thorne sends me against Lady Piggy, I'm going to slice me off a rasher of bacon." He laughed in Jon's face and left them there. Hours later, as the castle slept, 3 of them paid a call on his cell. Gren held his arms while Pip sat on his legs. Jon could hear Rast's rapid breathing as Ghost leapt onto his chest. The direwolf's eyes burned red as embers as his teeth nipped lightly at the soft skin of the boy's throat. Just enough to draw blood. "Remember, we know where you sleep," Jon said softly. Sam and Jon's other friends, brothers, are ultimately the glue that binds Jon to the wall. He whispers as much to Ghost in the following passage. Note that Ghost is repeatedly even more intimate with Jon than these friends. Sam, the other boys, and Ghost will be used again together to drive Jon's plot forward in several ways. In this passage, Jon reminisces about what Benjen had told him his new brothers would mean to him. "And so they were," he thought to himself, after Sam had taken his leave. Robb and Bran and Rickon were his father's sons, and he loved them still. Yet Jon knew that he had never truly been one of them. Catelyn Stark had seen to that. The grey walls of Winterfell might haunt his dreams, but Castle Black was his life now. And his brothers were Sam and Gren and Halder and Pip, and the other cast-outs who wore the black of the Night's Watch. "My uncle spoke truly," he whispered to Ghost. He wondered if he would ever see Benjen Stark again to tell him. A Game of Thrones, Jon V. Again, Jon has an encounter with Ghost, where his mood is described in the passive voice. A deep restlessness was on him. Certainly this could be an example of mirroring, but Jon mirroring Ghost's mood in this case. I think that Ghost was more restless, wanting to hunt. That said, Jon used his time writing to contemplate 2 things here. 1, deciding whether he was going to follow through and take his Night's Watch vows, and 2, figuring out how to keep Sam safe once he's promoted from training. Still, Ghost is the one who bolts away once they set out, confirming for me that he was the restless one. Ghost returns with a ret muzzle, having clearly made a kill. After having thought of his own decision on vows, while Ghost was off hunting, Jon thinks of Sam once again when Ghost returns. Ghost's thematic and possibly telepathic connection to Sam in Jon's thoughts is getting to be repetitive. Let's not forget that this scene with Ghost also coincides with Jon's decision to stay in the Watch. This seems a parallel to, and possibly foreshadowing to Jon deciding to stay in the Watch when Ghost returns from beyond the wall in A Storm of Swords. Was Ghost and/or some third-party influencer part of swaying Jon in both instances? "All we could do wasn't enough," Jon said. A deep restlessness was on him as he went back to Harden's tower for Ghost. The direwolf walked beside him to the stables. Some of the more skittish horses kicked at their stalls and laid back their ears as they entered. Jon saddled his mare, mounted, and rode out from Castle Black, south across the moonlit night. Ghost raced ahead of him, flying over the ground. Gone in the blink of an eye, Jon let him go. A wolf needed to hunt. Later that chapter. He wheeled his horse around and started for home. Ghost returned as he crested a rise and saw the distant glow of lamplight from the Lord Commander's tower. The direwolf's muzzle was red with blood as he trotted beside his horse. Jon found himself thinking of Samwell Tarly again on the ride back. By the time he reached the stables, he knew what he must do. Again, the passive voice coinciding with a mention of Ghost. Jon found himself thinking of Samwell Tarly. Not Jon thought of Samwell Tarly. There's a difference. That's twice in that short passage. Are these tells by our author, if you want to use the term from poker? I think they might be. When Jon puts his plan to save Sam into action, he mentions Ghost twice. He reminds us of the fear Ghost instills in enemies with the mention of Ghost threatening Rast. I do wonder what Aemon, a Targaryen but a Maester as well, a man with the foot in both the magical and magic-denying camps, thinks of this. Does he recognize Jon as a warg in this moment? Jon also mentions how Sam is good with Ghost, suggesting that he'll be good with the Ravens. This is truly a dubious argument, given how Sam is described to be fearful of everything. Yet it turns out to be the correct assumption. Recall our earlier judgment that Sam was initially fearful of Ghost, but very quickly soothed by the direwolf. Then consider the Night's Watch Ravens, all of which have latent skin changers, children of the forest, recall from Bran's story in A Dance with Dragons, in them. They have a similar way of quelling Sam's fears. Indeed, does Sam Tarly have some latent skin-changing ability? That may be the right conclusion here. He told them all of it, even the part where he'd set Ghost at Rast's throat. Maester Aemon listened silently, blind eyes fixed on the fire, but Chet's face darkened with each word. Without us to keep him safe, Sam will have no chance, Jon finished. He's hopeless with the sword. My sister Arya could tear him apart, and she's not yet 10. If Sir Alliser makes him fight, it's only a matter of time before he's hurt or killed. Later that chapter, Jon glanced warily at Chet, standing beside the door, his boils red and angry. He could help you, he said quickly. He can do sums, and he knows how to read and write. I know Chet can't read, and Clytus has weak eyes. Sam read every book in his father's library, and he'd be good with the ravens, too. Animals seemed to like him. Ghost took to him straight off. There's a lot he could do, besides fighting. The Night's Watch needs every man. Why kill one to no end? Make use of him instead. That hint at Sam being a skin changer concludes this episode. Next, we cover Ghost finding the Whites, the subsequent attack, and Jon's ill-fated choice to desert the Watch, derailed by none other than Ghost.
So high the wall above my eyes, but once I watched the sword of the morning rise.
Thanks to all the terrific artists who let me use their work on this YouTube video.
Her bell I'd ring in the window, but lies she'd sing. It's so lonely neath the shade of the wall.
Thanks especially to those of my family who helped in this series so far.
It's so lonely neath the shade of the wall so high.
If you enjoy this content, you can also consider supporting us on Patreon.